The mid-19th century in Brazil was a time of shimmering gold and deep, indelible blood. To the outside world, the empire was a beacon of tropical progress, a land of sprawling coffee plantations that fueled the cafes of Europe and enriched the crown in Rio de Janeiro. But this prosperity was built upon a skeleton of iron chains and broken spirits. The green gold, the coffee beans that blanketed the hills of the Paraíba Valley, was a crop harvested by the hands of millions who had been stolen from their ancestral lands. In this world, the sunlight did not bring warmth, it brought the signal for the whip to crack, marking the beginning of another day in a system that viewed human souls as mere fuel for an insatiable economic engine. The story unfolds within the borders of the Fazenda Santa Cruz, a titan of industry and a monument to human suffering. The manor house, with its whitewashed walls and grand colonnades, stood as a fortress of European refinement in the heart of the wild tropics. Inside, the elite lived in a dream of lace, porcelain, and French philosophy, blissfully detached from the reality outside their windows. However, the air surrounding the plantation was thick with a spiritual rot, a curse that infected both the oppressor and the oppressed. This is not just a tale of history, it is a descent into the moral fracture of a young heir, Pedro, who found himself born into the throne of a kingdom he loathed, and his silent, dangerous bond with Jorge, an enslaved youth whose resilience became a mirror to Pedro's own cowardice. As the empire began to tremble under the weight of abolitionist whispers and international pressure, the internal war within Santa Cruz mirrored the coming storm of a nation. The curse of slavery was not merely the physical pain of the lash, but the systematic destruction of identity and the poisoning of the land itself. To walk the halls of the manor was to walk over the graves of those who built them. To drink the coffee was to taste the salt of tears. This introduction sets the stage for a cinematic exploration of guilt, brotherhood, and the violent awakening of a conscience in a land where the law of the whip was the only god. The dawn over Fazenda Santa Cruz did not break with the gentleness of a new beginning, it arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that seemed to seep out of the very soil. From the high, ornate balcony of the manor house, the world looked like a masterfully painted lie. The mist clung to the valleys of the Paraíba region, softening the jagged edges of the mountain range, while the first rays of light turned the vast coffee groves into a sea of shimmering emerald. To any visiting merchant or diplomat, it was a vision of Eden. But for Pedro, the 18-year-old heir to this empire, the beauty was a mask for a charnel house. The air was already thick with the smell of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint, metallic tang of iron, the smell of the shackles being unlocked in the senzala below. The true pulse of the plantation was not found in the delicate clinking of silver spoons against porcelain in the dining room, but in the rhythmic, brutal percussion of the morning roll call. Pedro stood in the shadows of his room, his fingers tracing the expensive silk of his robe, feeling a profound sense of nausea. Below him, in the dirt courtyard, he watched his father, the Baron of Alencar, descend the stone steps. The Baron was a man of absolute verticality, a pillar of granite dressed in linen, whose very presence seemed to suck the oxygen out of the air. He moved with a terrifying grace, inspecting the rows of enslaved men and women as if they were livestock, his eyes devoid of malice but filled with something far worse, a complete, clinical indifference. To the Baron, the black bodies before him were not people, they were biological machines, assets to be depreciated until they were discarded in unmarked graves. Among those standing in the dust was Jorge. He was the same age as Pedro, born in the same week, and shared the same height and breadth of shoulder. But where Pedro's skin was pale and unblemished, Jorge's was a map of survival, dark, corded with lean muscle, and marked by the permanent dust of the fields. As the overseer, a man named Silverio with a face like scarred leather, paced the lines with a coiled whip, Jorge did something that no other man dared to do. He tilted his head back and looked directly at the manor's second floor. His gaze locked onto the window where Pedro stood hidden. It wasn't an appeal for help, it was an accusation. In that brief, agonizing second of eye contact, the entire social order of the empire felt like a fragile glass structure. Pedro pulled back into the darkness of his room, his heart hammering against his ribs, realizing that while Jorge was bound by iron, he was bound by blood and inheritance to a monster. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the machinery of Santa Cruz was in full, violent motion. The green gold demanded a sacrifice of sweat and dignity that never ended. From his study, Pedro could hear the distant, haunting melodies of the jongos rising from the fields, songs that sounded like prayers to the uninitiated, but were actually coded laments of a people refusing to be erased. The contrast was suffocating. The Baron was discussing the fluctuating prices in the port of Rio with a cold, intellectual fervor, while outside, a young mother was being pulled away from her child to begin a 14-hour shift in the scorching sun. This was the curse of the Alencar lineage, a wealth built on a foundation of salt and silk, where every luxury enjoyed in the Casa Grande was paid for by a soul crushed in the valley. The chapter ends with the Baron slamming a heavy ledger shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the silent house, signaling that the day's ledger of human misery had officially begun. The night at Fazenda Santa Cruz was never truly silent. It was a symphony of stifled moans, the rustle of the surrounding rainforest, and the omnipresent, rhythmic chirping of cicadas that seemed to vibrate with the tension of the land. As the moon rose, casting a ghostly, silver pallor over the coffee fields, the social boundaries of the day began to blur in the shadows. Pedro, driven by a restless fever of the soul, slipped out of the manor house, moving with the practiced stealth of a thief in his own home. He avoided the pools of yellow light from the oil lamps where the guards sat drinking cachaca, making his way toward the edge of the woods, near the crumbling stone walls of the old mill. This was the liminal space where the heir and the enslaved met, a sanctuary carved out of the darkness, far from the suffocating eyes of the Baron and the cruel reach of Silverio's whip. Jorge was already there, his silhouette merging with the gnarled roots of a massive colonial-era fig tree. Their meetings were an exercise in profound danger, a treason against the very foundations of the empire. If caught, Pedro would face his father's cold, social exile, but Jorge would face the trunk, or worse. Tonight, the air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and wood smoke. Pedro reached into his satchel and produced a tattered, candle-stained book, a collection of forbidden abolitionist essays and poems he had smuggled from his tutor's private library in the city. By the flickering light of a small, concealed lantern, Pedro began to whisper the words, translating the complex Portuguese into the simplified, rhythmic speech they had shared since childhood. To Jorge, these were not just words, they were weapons. The concept of liberty was no longer a ghost, it was becoming a tangible destination. The interaction was a raw study in human contrast and shared suffering. Pedro spoke of the guilt that felt like a leaden weight in his chest, the shame of eating bread earned through Jorge's agony. Jorge, however, did not offer Pedro the comfort of forgiveness. Instead, he spoke of the Quilombos, the legendary hidden kingdoms deep in the interior where the escaped lived as kings. He described them with such vividness that Pedro could almost see the smoke from their communal fires and hear the drums of a free people. Jorge's voice was a low, melodic vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. He wasn't just learning to read the white man's alphabet, he was deconstructing the white man's myth of superiority. Every letter Jorge mastered was a link broken in his psychic chains, and Pedro watched this transformation with a mixture of awe and a terrifying realization: his friend was becoming a revolutionary. The atmosphere of the chapter shifts when the distant bark of a hunting dog echoes through the valley. The shared dream of the two young men shattered instantly. Jorge vanished into the brush with the fluid grace of a predator, leaving Pedro alone in the cold moonlight. On his way back to the manor, Pedro passed the tronco, the whipping post, standing solitary in the courtyard like a jagged, wooden tooth. He touched the wood, feeling the deep rifts and dried blood ingrained in its grain. He realized then that the curse he felt wasn't just a metaphor, it was a physical contagion. The wealth of his family was a poison that had seeped into the water, the food, and the very air they breathed. As he climbed back into his window, Pedro looked at his hands, pale and soft, and felt a sudden, violent urge to scrub them raw. The secret they shared was a spark in a powder keg, and as the first hint of gray light appeared on the horizon, Pedro knew that the silence of the night could no longer protect them from the fire that was coming. The atmosphere of the plantation shifted from a simmering tension to a cold, suffocating dread with the arrival of the harvest's peak. The Baron of Alencar, dissatisfied with the production quotas, decided to tighten the iron grip of his authority. He summoned the overseer, Silverio, to the manor's veranda, a meeting that Pedro watched from the periphery of the grand hall. Silverio was a man whose soul seemed to have been replaced by the leather of his whip. He was the primary instrument of the curse, a man who took a perverse, mathematical pride in how much labor could be extracted from a body before it collapsed. The Baron's instructions were delivered with a terrifying, low-volume clarity. The pace must double, and any sluggishness was to be treated as a rebellion. To the Baron, the human cost was a mere footnote in his ledger, but to Pedro, it felt like the air itself was becoming too thick to breathe. As the sun climbed to its zenith, the valley became a furnace. The cinematic focus shifts to the fields, where the green gold loomed like an impenetrable wall. Enslaved men and women moved with a desperate, frantic energy, their movements dictated by the shadow of Silverio on his tall, black horse. The camera captures the visceral details of this labor, the salt-crusted skin, the flies congregating around open sores on shoulders, and the hollow, rhythmic sound of the coffee baskets being filled. Jorge was at the center of this storm, his strength making him a target for Silverio's scrutiny. The overseer sensed the subtle change in Jorge, a new, quiet dignity in his posture that Silverio interpreted as insolence. The tension was no longer just between classes, it was a personal, predatory focus. The breaking point arrived in the late afternoon, a scene captured with a jarring, high-contrast light that bleached the color from the landscape. A young girl, no older than 12, collapsed under the weight of her harvest basket. Before she could even gasp for air, Silverio was above her, his whip uncoiling like a serpent. Pedro, watching from the edge of the grove, felt his vision blur with a white-hot rage. But before he could move, Jorge stepped between the girl and the overseer. It was a moment of absolute cinema. The world seemed to stop, the wind died down, and the only sound was the heavy breathing of the two men. Jorge didn't raise a hand, he simply stood his ground, his eyes fixed on Silverio with a terrifying, silent defiance. It was a direct challenge to the curse, an act of humanity in a place designed to erase it. The chapter reaches its climax not with a fight, but with a psychological execution. Silverio, sensing the eyes of the entire workforce upon him, did not strike Jorge immediately. Instead, he smiled, a jagged, cruel expression, and ordered Jorge to be taken to the patio at sunset. The message was clear, a public example would be made to restore the order of the empire. Pedro returned to the manor house, his mind a chaotic storm of helplessness and fury. He found his father in the library, calmly sipping a glass of aged brandy, the sound of the girl's screams from the field seemingly unheard. The Baron looked at his son and remarked on the necessity of discipline for the preservation of their legacy. At that moment, Pedro realized that his father wasn't just a man, he was the architect of this agony. The curse of Santa Cruz was now undeniable, and as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the manor in a shade of blood red, Pedro knew that the time for secret whispers was over. The sunset at Fazenda Santa Cruz did not bring the cool relief of evening, but a suffocating, crimson twilight that felt like a prelude to an execution. The central courtyard, a space of packed red earth surrounded by the whitewashed walls of the manor and the dark, rotting timber of the senzala, became a grim amphitheater. The Baron of Alencar stood on the high veranda, a glass of dark wine in his hand, looking down with the detached curiosity of a god watching an ant being crushed. Below him, the entire enslaved population had been forced into a semicircle, their faces masks of stone, though their eyes flickered with a collective, burning grief. At the center stood the tronco, a blackened post of ironwood that had absorbed the blood of generations, a physical manifestation of the empire's foundational curse. Jorge was led to the post not as a broken victim, but with a terrifying, rhythmic stride that unnerved even the guards. When Silverio, the overseer, ordered his shirt to be removed, the scars of Jorge's past were revealed under the flickering torchlight, each mark a testament to a previous act of defiance. Pedro watched from the shadows of the colonnade, his stomach churning, his hands gripping the stone railing so hard his knuckles turned white. The first strike of the whip did not produce a scream, it produced a wet, sickening thud that echoed against the manor walls. Jorge's body lurched, his muscles convulsing under the leather, but he kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, refusing to grant the Baron the satisfaction of his pain. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat, raw iron, and the ozone of an approaching storm. Silverio, enraged by Jorge's silence, began to lose his calculated composure, his strikes becoming frantic and wild. With every lash, Pedro felt a piece of his own world crumbling, the lace, the poetry, and the French philosophy of his education were being revealed as grotesque ornaments on a structure of pure violence. The absolute cinema of the moment was found in the silence of the other enslaved workers, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight, a communal breathing that synchronized with Jorge's endurance. They weren't just watching a punishment, they were witnessing a soul that the whip could not reach, a realization that sent a shiver of true fear through the Baron's heart. As the 20th strike landed, the sky finally broke, and a torrential tropical rain began to wash the blood from the red earth. Silverio, exhausted and panting, lowered the whip, looking at Jorge's shredded back, yet the young man still stood, his head unbowed. The Baron turned and retreated into the house without a word, his silhouette momentarily framed by the lightning. Pedro waited until the courtyard cleared, then rushed into the freezing rain to Jorge's side. As he reached out to touch his friend, Jorge turned his head, his eyes glowing with a feverish, prophetic light. "It's starting, Pedro," he whispered through gritted teeth. The curse had finally reached its boiling point, and the rain could no longer wash away the scent of the coming revolution. The aftermath of the lashing left an invisible toxin circulating through the hallways of the manor house. Pedro moved through the grand rooms like a ghost, haunted by the phantom sound of the whip that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. His father, the Baron, attempted to maintain the facade of aristocratic normalcy, hosting a dinner for neighboring landowners to discuss the rising threat of abolitionist movements in the cities. The dining room was a theater of excess, sterling silver, heavy damask linens, and imported French wines, while just a few hundred yards away, Jorge lay in the darkness of a hidden cellar, his back a map of raw, pulsing agony. The absolute cinema of this chapter lies in the unbearable contrast between the polite clinking of crystal and the visceral reality of the infection that was beginning to rot the plantation from the inside out. Pedro's rebellion took a physical form as he began to steal medical supplies from the Baron's private cabinet, tinctures of opium, clean bandages, and antiseptic bombs. He spent his nights in the humid, subterranean gloom where Jorge was being kept, tending to wounds that should have been fatal. The air in the cellar was thick with the smell of gangrene and damp stone, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of the house above. As Pedro cleaned Jorge's back, the two young men shared a dialogue of desperation. Jorge's fever brought forth visions not of pain, but of a burning sky, a prophecy of Santa Cruz engulfed in flames. He spoke of the ancestors watching from the trees, waiting for the blood on the soil to reach the roots of the great fig tree. Pedro realized that the friend he once knew was being forged into something else, a martyr or a monster, born from the very cruelty his father had engineered. The tension reached a breaking point when Silverio, suspicious of the missing supplies, began to prowl the manor at night like a predatory animal. The chapter reaches its peak in a terrifying game of shadows within the house's servant corridors. Pedro, clutching a bottle of stolen medicine, found himself cornered by the overseer in a narrow hallway illuminated only by a single, flickering candle. Silverio did not speak, he simply loomed, his presence a silent threat, representing the ironclad law of the plantation that even the air could not break. However, the Baron's sudden appearance from the study broke the stalemate. The look of disappointment in the Baron's eyes as he glanced at his son's disheveled state was more piercing than any blade. The chapter closes with the Baron ordering the cellar to be boarded up, sealing Jorge inside. Pedro stood in the rain-slicked courtyard, watching the hammers fall, realizing that the curse had finally separated him from his humanity, leaving him a prisoner of his own bloodline. The aftermath of the lashing left an invisible toxin circulating through the hallways of the manor house. Pedro moved through the grand rooms like a ghost, haunted by the phantom sound of the whip that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. His father, the Baron, attempted to maintain the facade of aristocratic normalcy, hosting a dinner for neighboring landowners to discuss the rising threat of abolitionist movements in the cities. The dining room was a theater of excess, sterling silver, heavy damask linens, and imported French wines, while just a few hundred yards away, Jorge lay in the darkness of a hidden cellar, his back a map of raw, pulsing agony. The absolute cinema of this chapter lies in the unbearable contrast between the polite clinking of crystal and the visceral reality of the infection that was beginning to rot the plantation from the inside out. Pedro's rebellion took a physical form as he began to steal medical supplies from the Baron's private cabinet, tinctures of opium, clean bandages, and antiseptic bombs. He spent his nights in the humid, subterranean gloom where Jorge was being kept, tending to wounds that should have been fatal. The air in the cellar was thick with the smell of gangrene and damp stone, a stark contrast to the lavender-scented air of the house above. As Pedro cleaned Jorge's back, the two young men shared a dialogue of desperation. Jorge's fever brought forth visions not of pain, but of a burning sky, a prophecy of Santa Cruz engulfed in flames. He spoke of the ancestors watching from the trees, waiting for the blood on the soil to reach the roots of the great fig tree. Pedro realized that the friend he once knew was being forged into something else, a martyr or a monster, born from the very cruelty his father had engineered. The tension reached a breaking point when Silverio, suspicious of the missing supplies, began to prowl the manor at night like a predatory animal. The chapter reaches its peak in a terrifying game of shadows within the house's servant corridors. Pedro, clutching a bottle of stolen medicine, found himself cornered by the overseer in a narrow hallway illuminated only by a single, flickering candle. Silverio did not speak, he simply loomed, his presence a silent threat, representing the ironclad law of the plantation that even the heir could not break. However, the Baron's sudden appearance from the study broke the stalemate. The look of disappointment in the Baron's eyes as he glanced at his son's disheveled state was more piercing than any blade. The chapter closes with the Baron ordering the cellar to be boarded up, sealing Jorge inside. Pedro stood in the rain-slicked courtyard, watching the hammers fall, realizing that the curse had finally separated him from his humanity, leaving him a prisoner of his own bloodline. The moon was a cold, silver blade cutting through the canopy of the rainforest, illuminating the path of a betrayal that had been brewing for generations. Pedro stood at the edge of the plantation, the carved wooden totem heavy in his pocket, feeling the oppressive weight of the manor house at his back. For the first time, the grand structure looked like a tomb, a mausoleum of white stone and red tile that had swallowed the lives of thousands. Behind him, the smoke from the Senzala's dying fires curled into the air like ghostly fingers, but the silence was different tonight. It wasn't the silence of exhaustion, it was the breath-holding stillness of a predator waiting to strike. Jorge moved through the shadows with a ghostly fluidity that defied his recent injuries. His back was a landscape of silver scars, a map of the Empire's cruelty that he now wore as armor. As they reached the perimeter of the coffee fields, where the domesticated land met the untamed, ancient forest, the air changed. The scent of roasted coffee and manure was replaced by the overwhelming fragrance of damp moss, wild orchids, and rotting vegetation. This was the threshold. To cross it was to renounce the law of the Baron and enter a realm where the only king was the one who could survive. Pedro looked back at the lights of the Casa Grande, seeing his father's silhouette in the library window, a small, fragile figure clutching a dying world, and for a fleeting second, he felt a pang of hollow grief for the man he was about to destroy. The journey into the deep interior was a descent into a primal reality. The forest seemed to recognize Jorge, the branches parting for him while snagging at Pedro's fine linen clothes, tearing away the remnants of his aristocratic identity. They were being watched. Dozens of eyes reflected the moonlight from the high branches, the scouts of the Quilombo. These were men and women who had committed the ultimate sin of the Empire, they had taken back their own lives. When they finally reached the hidden settlement, a fortress of wood and spirit tucked into a limestone canyon, Pedro was met not with open arms, but with the cold steel of machetes. He was the son of the butcher, a carrier of the plague, and as Jorge stepped forward to mediate, Pedro realized that his redemption would not be found in words, but in the total surrender of everything he once owned. The heart of the Quilombo was a defiant sanctuary, a labyrinth of earthworks and sharp-timbered palisades hidden beneath a canopy so dense it strangled the moonlight. Inside this hidden fortress, the air vibrated with the low, rhythmic hum of communal life, the sound of iron being forged into spearheads and the hushed tones of a council planning a war. Pedro stood in the center of a mud-packed clearing, surrounded by warriors whose bodies were testaments to the curse they had outrun. Their eyes, sharp and unforgiving, traced the softness of his hands and the expensive cut of his tattered trousers. To them, he was a living relic of the manor, a vessel of the very bloodline that had hunted them with dogs and shackled them in the dark. The leader of the settlement was an elder named Zumbi, not the man of legend, but a living echo of his spirit, whose face was a topography of deep lines and ancient wisdom. He sat upon a throne made of twisted jacaranda roots, his presence casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the history of the entire valley. When Jorge presented Pedro as an ally, the clearing fell into a silence so profound it felt like the forest itself was listening. Zumbi didn't look at Pedro's face, he looked at his shadow. He spoke of the debt of the father, a spiritual weight that could not be paid in gold or apologies, but only in the complete dismantling of the system that sustained the Alencar name. Pedro realized that being a good man was an insufficient shield in this place. He was a symptom of a cancer, and his mere presence was a provocation to those who had bled to be free. The night concluded with a ritual of fire and iron. Jorge, standing between his two worlds, took a red-hot brand from the communal hearth and held it inches from Pedro's chest. The heat was a physical wall, a searing reminder of the pain Jorge had endured on the Tronco. The choice was presented with brutal clarity. Pedro could remain an observer, a tourist of the revolution, or he could provide the intelligence needed to bring the Baron's empire to its knees. To save the friend, Pedro had to betray the father. As the flames danced in the dark pupils of Jorge's eyes, the young heir felt the final threads of his old life snap. He began to speak, his voice trembling but growing stronger as he detailed the plantation's hidden armory, the patrol schedules of Silverio's men, and the structural weaknesses of the manor house. The curse was now flowing in reverse, and the architect's son was handing over the keys to the fortress. The descent from the highlands back toward the valley felt like a slow crawl into the mouth of a waiting beast. Pedro returned to the Fazenda Santa Cruz under the cover of a pre-dawn fog, his skin still smelling of the wood smoke and damp earth of the Quilombo. As he slipped back through his bedroom window, the transition was jarring, the silk sheets felt abrasive, like sandpaper against his conscience. The house was silent, yet every creak of the floorboard sounded like an accusation. He was no longer just a spectator of the tragedy, he was the primary infiltrator, a mole in the house of Alencar. His mission was to steal the Black Ledger, a hidden record kept by his father that detailed the illegal purchase of enslaved people after the 1850 ban, evidence that could strip the Baron of his title and his land before the revolution even fired a single shot. Finding the ledger required Pedro to enter the Baron's private sanctum, the library, during the high heat of the afternoon when the house was supposedly at rest. The room was a monument to the European Enlightenment, filled with leather-bound books by Voltaire and Rousseau, yet the air was stale with the stench of the system they ignored. Pedro's hands shook as he bypassed the false panels behind the heavy mahogany desk. When the hidden compartment clicked open, he didn't find gold, he found a stack of cold, meticulously kept journals. These books were a ledger of human lives reduced to numbers, documenting the mortality rates of children and the price of souls bought in the dead of night. As Pedro tucked the books into his coat, he felt the physical weight of the curse, the tangible proof that his father's entire legacy was a criminal enterprise built on a foundation of stolen breath. The tension reached a fever pitch when the Baron entered the room, catching Pedro in the act of closing the hidden panel. The confrontation was a battle of silence and subtext. The Baron did not scream, he merely stood by the window, the sunlight catching the silver in his hair, and spoke of the burden of inheritance. He told Pedro that the plantation was a living organism that required a firm hand to survive the changing tides of the world. He looked at his son with a terrifying, paternal affection, unaware that Pedro was carrying the very evidence that would lead to his ruin. The irony was a suffocating shroud. Pedro managed to stammer an excuse and flee the room, but as he crossed the courtyard, he saw Silverio watching him from the stables, the overseer's eyes narrowing with a predatory suspicion. The game of shadows had become a race against time, and the fuse of the rebellion had been lit from within the heart of the manor itself. The atmosphere at Santa Cruz grew heavy with a pre-storm stillness, a dense humidity that seemed to trap the scent of the dying coffee blossoms against the earth. Pedro had successfully channeled the stolen ledgers to the messengers of the Quilombo, but the price of his betrayal was a growing, paralyzing paranoia. Every look from a domestic servant, every clink of silverware during the silent dinners with his father, felt like a premonition of discovery. The Baron, however, remained obsessed with the physical world, ordering Silverio to increase the patrols around the perimeter. He sensed a change in the wind, a restlessness in the air, that he attributed to the heat, never imagining that the rot had already consumed the very heart of his home. The curse was no longer a distant threat, it was a rhythmic pulse, beating in time with the drums that began to echo from the deep forest at night, low, vibrating tones that only the oppressed and the guilty could hear. The tension broke when Silverio captured a young runaway on the northern edge of the property. Instead of the usual public lashing, the overseer, acting on the Baron's increasing anxiety, dragged the captive into the central courtyard for an interrogation that bordered on a ritual of terror. Pedro was forced to stand by his father's side on the veranda, playing the role of the dutiful heir while watching the boy he had secretly tutored being broken in the dirt. The absolute cinema of the moment was the visual of the Baron's calm, manicured hand resting on Pedro's shoulder, a gesture of fatherly pride that felt like the grip of a corpse. Below, Silverio discovered a scrap of paper in the boy's tunic, a map of the manor's internal corridors, written in Pedro's own distinctive, educated script. The silence that followed was more violent than any scream, as the overseer turned his gaze from the bleeding boy toward the balcony. The chapter reaches its peak as the mask finally slips. The Baron took the paper, his eyes scanning his son's handwriting with a slow, agonizing realization that transformed his face from granite indifference to a mask of ancient, wounded rage. He didn't strike Pedro, he simply leaned in and whispered that the blood of the Alancars is poisoned, finally acknowledging the curse that had haunted their lineage. Before Silverio could ascend the stairs to seize the heir, the first torch was thrown from the darkness of the coffee groves. It landed in the dry thatch of the processing shed, the flames licking hungrily at the green gold. The drums in the forest stopped, replaced by a single, high-pitched horn blast that signaled the end of the harvest of coffee and the beginning of the harvest of iron. The rebellion hadn't just arrived at the gates, it was being led by the evidence Pedro had provided, and the night was suddenly as bright as day. The night erupted into a chaotic tableau of fire and shadow as the green gold became the fuel for a monumental pyre. The flames climbed the dry coffee bushes with a predatory roar, turning the valley into a bowl of orange heat. On the veranda, the Baron stood motionless, the reflection of his burning empire dancing in his hollow eyes. He looked at Pedro not as a father looks at a son, but as a king looks at a regicide. The air was filled with the screaming of horses and the frantic ringing of the plantation bell, a sound that usually commanded obedience but now served only as a funeral knell. Silverio drew his pistol, his face contorted by the realization that his reign of terror was being dismantled by the very boy he had once dismissed as a soft-handed dreamer. The surge from the darkness was not a disorganized mob, but a disciplined wave of retribution. Led by Jorge, the warriors of the Quilombo breached the main gates, their machetes gleaming like shards of fallen stars. They did not move with mindless rage, they moved with the precision of men who were reclaiming their stolen time. Pedro found himself caught in the no-man's land between the manor's collapsing pillars and the advancing line of fire. He saw Jorge across the courtyard, a vision of scarred majesty, his silhouette framed by the burning drying sheds. For a moment, the world narrowed down to the two of them, the heir who had burned his bridge and the man who had risen from the dirt to claim the torch. The curse was being incinerated in real time, the smoke carrying the stench of centuries of scorched dreams into the black sky. The chapter culminates in a visceral confrontation within the grand hall of the Casa Grande. As the enslaved workers burst through the mahogany doors, the illusion of European refinement shattered into 1,000 pieces of porcelain and glass. The Baron retreated to his study, clutching the heavy ledger of his ancestors as if the ink could shield him from the iron. Pedro stood in the doorway, a witness to the final collapse of his lineage. Silverio made a desperate stand at the foot of the stairs, but he was silenced not by a blade, but by the collective weight of those he had broken. As the first embers began to catch on the heavy velvet curtains, the house began to groan, a deep, structural moan that signaled the end of the Alencar era. The fire was no longer just outside, it had found its way into the heart of the throne. The smoke inside the manor was a thick, suffocating shroud that tasted of ancient dust and expensive wallpaper. Pedro pushed through the heavy fumes, his lungs burning, until he reached the threshold of the Baron's study. The room was a scene of stagnant, frozen tragedy. The Baron sat in his leather armchair, the stolen ledger spread across his lap, while the heat from the hallway caused the fine French brandy in his glass to tremble. Outside, the screams of the dying empire had transitioned into a low, terrifying hum of liberation. The fire had reached the upper floors, and the ceiling groaned as the weight of the chandeliers threatened to come crashing down. This was the inner sanctum of the curse, the place where the math of human suffering had been calculated for decades, and it was now a furnace. The confrontation between father and son was stripped of all pretense. The Baron looked up, his face illuminated by the flickering orange glow of the burning curtains. He didn't offer a plea for his life. Instead, he offered a final, bitter lesson. He spoke of the law of the land, claiming that the blood spilled was merely the price of building a civilization in a wilderness. He laughed a dry, hollow sound, mocking Pedro's alliance with the Quilombo, calling him a traitor to his own skin, who would eventually be discarded by those he sought to save. Pedro, holding the wooden totem Jorge had given him, realized that his father's soul was not just corrupted, it was extinct. The man before him was a ghost of a dead world, clinging to paper records while the reality of iron and fire stood at his door. The doors to the study burst open as Jorge entered, followed by a cadre of warriors whose shadows loomed like titans against the burning walls. The air in the room became electrified. Jorge didn't strike immediately. He stood before the Baron, the man who had ordered his back shredded, and looked at him with a gaze of profound, cold clarity. The power dynamic of the Empire had inverted in an instant. The Baron, realizing that his words had no purchase in this new world, finally dropped the ledger. As the fire began to consume the mahogany desk, Jorge turned to Pedro and offered him a choice: to leave his father to the flames or to carry the weight of his survival into a world that would never forgive him. The chapter ends as the main beam of the study cracks, sending a shower of sparks over the three men, the smoke finally drowning the Baron's last attempts to speak. The heat in the study reached a point of absolute sensory distortion, turning the air into a shimmering liquid. Pedro looked at his father, then at Jorge, the two pillars of his existence, one representing a legacy of chains, the other a future of fire. The decision was made not in the mind, but in the instinct of a collapsing soul. Pedro grabbed the Baron by his linen lapels, dragging the catatonic man from his chair just as a section of the ceiling collapsed, burying the mahogany desk in a tomb of burning cedar and ash. Jorge watched with a neutral, chilling detachment. He did not help, but he did not hinder. He simply turned and walked through the wall of smoke, his silence a final severance of the brotherhood they had shared as children. The debt of blood was now being collected, and Jorge was no longer a friend, but the vanguard of a new world. The escape from the burning manor was a descent through the circles of a private hell. Pedro hauled the dead weight of his father through corridors where the plaster was bubbling like skin. They passed the grand dining room, where the long table was engulfed in flames, the silver melting into distorted puddles, a literal liquefaction of the family's wealth. Outside, the courtyard had become a surreal landscape of liberation and ruin. The black ledger was being tossed into the bonfires by the former captives, the ink that had enslaved them now feeding the flames. The Baron, breathing in the thick soot of his own scorched empire, finally began to weep, not for the lives he had destroyed, but for the loss of the order he worshipped. To Pedro, those tears felt like a final, disgusting toxin being purged from the land. As they reached the edge of the forest, Pedro collapsed under the weight of his father, looking back at the skeleton of the Casa Grande. The whitewashed walls were now blackened husks, and the great colonnade stood like charred ribs against the night sky. The curse had physically manifested as a pillar of smoke that rose miles into the atmosphere, visible to the entire valley. Jorge and the warriors vanished into the darkness of the trees, leaving the heir and the broken Baron alone on the cooling earth. There was no victory in this moment, only the raw, hollow clarity of total destruction. The social contract of the Empire had been burned to a cinder, and as the first rain began to fall, mixing with the ash to create a gray, suffocating mud, Pedro realized that while he had saved his father's life, he had lost the right to his own name. The morning after the fire brought a sun that was pale and sickly, filtered through a permanent veil of gray ash that coated every leaf and stone in the valley. The Fazenda Santa Cruz was no longer a monument of power, it was a smoking wound in the side of the mountain. Pedro sat on the damp earth at the edge of the property, his hands stained a deep, indelible black from the charcoal of his own home. Beside him, the Baron was a hollow shell, his eyes fixed on the charred remains of the library. The man spoke in fragments, whispering to ghosts about harvest quotas and the price of coffee in London, his mind having retreated into a world that the fire had wiped clean. The curse had not taken the Baron's life, it had taken his reality, leaving him a living ghost haunted by a ledger that no longer existed. The silence of the valley was absolute, broken only by the occasional crash of a weakened wall or the distant cry of a carrion bird. The army of the Quilombos had retreated into the deep interior, taking with them the livestock, the tools, and the liberated souls, leaving the Alancars with nothing but the scorched earth and the bitter memories of their reign. Pedro wandered through the ruins of the courtyard, finding the tronco standing alone amidst the debris. It was the only thing the fire had failed to consume. The ironwood was too dense, too saturated with the history of pain to ignite. He touched the wood and felt no heat, only a cold, ancient vibration. He realized then that the revolution had not just been about reclaiming freedom, but about leaving the oppressors to rot in the silence of their own vacuum. The chapter ends with a haunting realization of isolation. As Pedro looked toward the road that led to the city, he saw the silhouettes of the neighboring landowners' militias approaching, men coming not to help, but to reclaim the land and suppress the contagion of rebellion. Pedro knew that for the Empire, the fire at Santa Cruz was a signal for a more brutal repression. He looked at his father, then at the impenetrable wall of the forest where Jorge had vanished. There was no place for him in the world of the militia, and no place for him in the world of the free. He was the bridge that had been burned from both ends, a man standing in the center of a void. The curse of his blood was now a mark that he would carry into a future that offered no forgiveness, only the long, slow march toward an uncertain exile. The arrival of the imperial cavalry was not a rescue, but a cold, military harvest. The horses' hooves churned the gray ash into a thick, dark slurry as the soldiers moved through the ruins of Santa Cruz like vultures picking at a carcass. Pedro watched from a distance as they seized the Baron, dragging the broken aristocrat toward a carriage with the same clinical indifference the Baron had once shown his own laborers. There would be no trial of conscience, only a quiet removal of a man who had allowed the contagion of liberty to ignite on his watch. The Empire was an organism that purged its own failed cells, and as the carriage disappeared down the mud-slicked road, Pedro realized that the Alencar name was being erased from the ledger of history, replaced by a silence more profound than the fire. Pedro did not follow. He turned his back on the road and walked toward the edge of the forest, the place where the civilized world ended and the truth began. He found the massive fig tree where he and Jorge had shared their whispered dreams. Carved into its bark was a new mark, not the totem of the Quilombos, but a simple, jagged line that pointed toward the setting sun. It was a final message, a trail left not for a friend, but for a survivor. The air here was clear of smoke, smelling of ozone and the deep, fertile rot of the jungle. Pedro stripped off his scorched linen coat, leaving the last garment of his privilege tangled in the thorns. He stepped into the shadows of the canopy, his bare feet finally touching the same soil that had claimed the lives of those his family had owned. The story of Fazenda Santa Cruz ended not with a bang, but with the slow, relentless reclamation of nature. Within years, the vines would choke the blackened pillars of the manor, and the coffee trees would be swallowed by the surging green of the tropics. The curse was not lifted, but buried, hidden beneath layers of silt and leaf litter, waiting for future generations to dig through the ash. Pedro disappeared into the emerald labyrinth, a man without a country, a name, or a past, seeking a redemption that might never come. Behind him, the valley grew still, the silence of the forest finally drowning out the echoes of the whip, leaving only the sound of the rain washing the blood of the Empire deep into the unyielding earth.